As a public folklorist who is also a professor at a Research One university, I'm called to do a great many things. I administer grants, conduct fieldwork, award fellowships, and facilitate apprenticeships. Often, I also produce special projects, such as public events, festivals, recordings, print publications, and documentary videos. These regularly are in response to community and artist needs, based on working with them while doing my annual programmatic work of facilitating apprenticeships and heritage fellowships. However, one facet of my work that is central to my public practice is the curation of exhibitions. Since my early days in graduate school, I worked to translate my scholarly endeavors into publicly accessible content. Over the years, I have often felt that my curatorial efforts were misunderstood by my colleagues. A few years ago, I presented at AFS about how my filmmaking process allowed me to labor alongside makers, and that videography forced me to fully focus on the creative process, revealing the aesthetics that many makers may struggle to express through words. In this presentation, I similarly explore how my curatorial practice, that is, my research, design, display, and programmatic approach to exhibition production, works to deepen my relationship with research collaborators and increase my understanding of their traditional arts practices. These research insights are not an accidental byproduct of my curatorial practice, but rather a primary reason behind it. While folklorists may conduct years of ethnographic research to produce a public-facing exhibition, exhibit creation can also be an effective research method. Just as a university professor feels the push to publish or perish, so too the public folklorist feels a pressure to program or perish, as my friend Jan Rosenberg used to quip. However, these activities are not that far removed from each other. We write to report on research findings, but also to deepen our understanding of the topic as we write. Yes, we conduct fieldwork, but it's not until we write that we try on ideas and begin to understand what the data is telling us. We transcribe interviews, log photographs, and review the film footage to understand our experiences and what our collaborators were trying to tell us. It is in this process that we discover the so what of our research. My research method often follows a similar trajectory. Through fieldwork, I meet a community-based artist or maker whose work connects with a topic that I want to understand better. Perhaps creative practice in later life, traditional arts and environmental degradation, intergenerational reciprocity, or the connections between creative practice and human well-being. Then I start to scratch at it. I dig to understand. I broaden the sources of data. I listen to what the fieldwork reveals. However, it's often while producing public-facing programs, exhibitions, and publications that I begin to gain deeper insight. It is in this co-labor of cultural presentation that I forge a deeper connection with the maker, musician, or narrator. At an event, I also capture new data, photographs, video, and audio recordings. And after the event, as in fieldwork, I process this new data, converting it into meaningful formats that can be shared with collaborators. As the state folklorist of Indiana, I have interviewed hundreds or perhaps even thousands of people at this point. Many, actually most, will never be featured in a public program, documentary video, scholarly article, or museum exhibition, although each of them have helped shape my understanding of vernacular culture and the expressive forms they practice. After I leave the field, sometimes interviews and fieldwork materials nag at me. Like a peg looking for a matching hole, I may circle back to these materials years later. I don't always know why. Perhaps I didn't have the right lenses to see the so what when I first collected the data. Or maybe the world or the context had changed since I first encountered it. Sometimes a documented practice accumulates greater significance over time, or still yet it might simply be that my scholarly interests continued to evolve and a new opportunity presented itself. My interest in wooden bowl cueing was like this. I interviewed my first bowl cuer in 1995. 9 years later, I met bowl maker Keith Rubel. That was shortly after I became the director of Traditional Arts Indiana. He had been recognized by our State Fair Masters program for his work demonstrating bowl cueing at the Indiana State Fair a couple of years before. It would be a decade before I did a public program with him or revisited his fieldwork. In 2014, I partnered with state parks to produce a series of programs that explored natural resources and craft practices. I remembered Keith and his distinctive bowl hewing, and I thought the park growers would enjoy seeing him work. So alongside stone carvers and drum making and decoy carving and willow basket making, Keith chopped out wooden bowls at the Hoosier Outdoor Experience. During those demonstrations, I learned more about Keith and his craft than I had in the previous 10 years. Year after year, I had watched him quietly hewing wooden bowls at the Indiana State Fair, but it was not until we worked together that I began to see the significance of his work. He opened up about his strong belief that every person should have a practice that they could devote themselves to, especially in later life, a concept that became central to my arts and aging research. Keith and I then collaborated on producing a bowl-making documentary. From my time with Keith, I learned that bowl hewing in Indiana is distinctive. It's different from the Scandinavian Appalachian bowl carving traditions. It had a different history and a different aesthetic. So during the pandemic, I began poring over my interviews and photographs. I reached out to Keith and suggested that we produce a small exhibit about Indiana bowl carving. He gently corrected me. "We don't carve bowls, we hew bowls," he told me. This subtle distinction was important. It articulated the process, aesthetics, and genealogy of the craft. I got the names of other bowl hewers from Keith, and as the pandemic eased, I began fieldwork again. Keith's hewing observation was echoed by the other makers. Among the Indiana bowl hewers, it is common to retain and even accentuate the hewing marks rather than carving and sanding them out. In fact, makers cut deep furrows through the wood with an adze to produce an artfully rustic appearance to their bowls. I began to see the craft with different eyes. I curated a small exhibit in my university's Scholars Commons, a small exhibit space located in the lobby of the main library on campus. The exhibit included bowls, tools, videos, text, and photographs. The Scholars Commons is a place to prototype ideas, which was always the plan. As I noted, just as a writer must rewrite, I often produce small exhibits. The first small exhibit was just like a draft, a proof of concept. It also allows me to share ideas with the makers, to get their feedback, to discuss options, and to imagine what and where and how we might grow the exhibit. The first exhibit, Wood and Adze, the revival of bowl hewing in Indiana, was small. It included several bowls by Keith, and then one or two from each of the other makers. 4 of the hewers featured came to the campus and demonstrated their craft and participated in a narrative stage. After seeing the small exhibition, the bowl hewers wanted to do another, this time closer to where they lived in Terre Haute, Indiana. So I reached out to the Swope Museum of Art, which is located there. There I curated Art of the Adze bowl hewing in Indiana. I greatly expanded this exhibition to include more makers and increased the number of artifacts, and included large format photographs, and included several archival images as well. I report all of this to share that while I had met the bowl hewers and makers before, this exhibition expanded and deepened my understanding of the tradition. Through our curatorial process, I gathered more data. I learned about their needs and the interests of the makers. I accumulated materials that I hope someday will result in a book or an article. The exhibition gave me an excuse to do the work. It wasn't me just interviewing them about their work to write about it in a book or an article that they may not read. Instead, it was something we created together. It was something they could share with their community. I learned what they thought was important to include in the exhibition to tell others about the craft. The exhibition became a collaborative process, more so than my typical academic paper. The bowl makers would call me to tell me things and talk about their work. Without the exhibition, I would not have had the reason to connect the dots back to Bill Day, to learn that there was a network of bowl makers nationwide who had learned from Bill and from Keith. It was in the narrative stages where we talked about each other's work and shared their stories about their mentor and the praise they gave to Keith Rubel for championing the craft of Bill Day's legacy that I learned the most. As part of the exhibition, I organized this chop-in, I called it, for the opening. 8 bowl makers came together to chop and to talk to the public. They didn't want to just be featured in the exhibit. They wanted to be a part of it. The Art of the Adze exhibition and its earlier iteration, Wood and Adze, however, were not the first exhibits that I did to advance my research interests or to serve my collaborators. In 2005, I curated 2 basketry exhibits. Oak rod basketry was a symbolically important craft for my home community of Brown County, Indiana, throughout much of the 20th century. For more than a decade, I copied, photographed, clipped newspaper articles, reviewed archival interviews, and collected baskets. But it wasn't until I curated an exhibit about these baskets and their makers that a story about the politics of folk culture came into focus. I had hoped that curating an exhibition would allow me to talk to people about their memories of the craft, but I soon discovered that there were few who remembered the older artisans. Nevertheless, community members shared family photographs and paintings, and other collectors showed me their antique baskets. Like the bowl queuing exhibition, I plan to revise and to iterate on this exhibition. Based on the first exhibit, Working Wood Oak Rod Baskets in Indiana, which was at the Mathers Museum of World Culture, I published a couple of articles. Then I installed a second version in the historic Brown County Art Gallery called Art with a Purpose, Brown County Baskets. I reworked this exhibition and text to incorporate new materials that told the story about how these agricultural tools became popular tourist souvenirs. The research developed for and from the second exhibition resulted in an essay and an edited volume about traditional and contemporary baskets in the United States. Employing an iterative process has allowed me over and over to revise and refocus, as well as to expand and deepen my research. Along with the Brown County basket exhibits, I curated a solo artist exhibition at the Mathers Museum, featuring Vicki Graber, a willow basket maker whose father, Leroy Graber, was a 2010 National Heritage Fellow. This exhibition built upon years of fieldwork with the artist, as well as data collected and produced from the dozens of public programs we did together, such as craft demonstrations, narrative stages, and hands-on workshops. Her exhibit, Willow Work, Vicki Graber Basket Maker, included a sampling of traditional and contemporary designed baskets made by Vicki. The exhibition also included a couple of baskets made by Vicki's father, as well as one woven by her great-grandfather. These historical baskets showed the ways that Vicki's work was deeply rooted in family tradition, but also made clear that she was stretching that tradition. Her keen sense of color, the way she played with form, as well as her interest in learning from other makers who were both inside and outside her community, became central to the theme in the show. As the daughter of a Heritage Fellow, many wanted her to make baskets like her father and great-grandfather, which she was happy to do. But she was not making artifacts or antiques. She is a contemporary basket maker, making contemporary baskets. Our exhibition was collaborative. She shared with me the baskets she wanted to make. I received funding to acquire baskets for the museum collection, and as we worked together, the story of her craft became less about tradition and more about the individual maker and her creative impulse. Without the exhibit, my work with Vicki might have continued to frame her craft as continuing a tradition, but it was through our conversations and the exhibition that my curatorial method, that a more complex and interesting story, actually emerged. I could share with you several exhibitions that have advanced my research interests and deepened my scholarly understanding. However, for the remainder of my time, I want to focus on another small basket exhibit that I curated with my graduate assistant, Tauhidul Islam. A culture-carried chin basketry in central Indiana was produced this fall at Indiana University's Process Gallery. The exhibition included around 38 different baskets made by 2 Zope basket makers from Chin State, Myanmar. In fact, Indiana is home to nearly 40,000 Chin refugees, most of whom live on the south side of Indianapolis. In the summer of 2021, I began conducting fieldwork with Pu Nai Chum and Reverend Pu Cheole. The 2 elders had learned to make baskets when they were boys in Burma, but returned to the craft in later life. I began my work with them as part of the Chin Folk Life Survey that I conducted with my linguistic colleagues, Kelly Berkson and Kenneth Van Bick. The survey collected oral histories from Chin elders who shared stories of family practices, community rituals, and children's games. In addition to the oral histories collected, I visited with area craftspeople and learned about their weaving, instrument making, and basketry practices. As you may have guessed, basketry has been a craft that has captured my attention for several decades. I've worked with palmetto, pine needle, and sweetgrass basket makers in Florida, white oak and willow basket weavers in Kentucky. I've documented the making of rice baskets from bamboo in southwest China and the stitching of elm bark in Indiana, or Miami-Yonki, as my Miami friends refer to it. So I was drawn to the work of Nachum and Reverend Lay. They use repurposed plastic strapping found in area warehouses to make their baskets, rather than the rattan that they used to gather in Burma. I had met the two makers on the same day when my two fieldwork assistants introduced me to them and translated for me as I conducted my initial interviews. I returned to shoot 2 documentary videos with the makers, and then invited Nachum to campus to demonstrate his craft. Later, I worked with both makers to do hands-on workshops and classes for their community. From the beginning, I told them that I would like to create an exhibit about their baskets if they were interested. Once they learned of my interest in baskets and that I wanted to show others their traditional art, they were excited. Since then, each started making me examples of baskets recalled from their youth, and I was happy to buy the baskets. They may be baskets for catching fish and gathering millet, transporting poultry and holding baby chicks, cooking fish, processing food, winnowing rice and sifting corn, and so many more. In September, we mounted a culture carried, where we artfully arranged the baskets, drafted text to explain their various forms and uses. The exhibition also included documentary footage of both baskets being made and baskets being used. As I worked with the makers, their families, and my Chin students, I learned about the gendered uses of the baskets, the recent development of baskets as symbolic objects, expressions of Chin identity. As I crafted text and interpretive themes based on my understanding of the work, I shared it with the makers and their families. While I was clear with the basket makers from the beginning that I wanted to curate an exhibit that showed their baskets to others, I didn't realize that they had no frame of reference for what this would be like. They understood craft demonstrations and selling their wares. These were things they did for their community. But the exhibit, or to show, they assumed that I would just set them out for people to see. When they saw the exhibit with a large format photograph, exhibit text, looping video monitors of them weaving baskets and their baskets artfully arranged, we hung them on the walls like paintings in a gallery and placed them on pedestals like sculptures. The two makers clapped their hands when they saw it. They cheered and patted me on the back, and then they grew quiet and they wiped tears from their eyes. Since then, they've been even more interested in doing work with me, asking to do more demonstrations rather than waiting for me to contact them, which I read as a deepening of our collaborative relationship. When we did a gallery talk, I strived to make the focus on the makers as much as possible, who spoke to the audience through our project translator, MM. Each told their story of their craft. Reverend Lay especially enjoyed explaining to the audience about his craft and the traditional uses of baskets back in Burma, as well as here in Indiana. The exhibitions and the public presentations associated with them are central to my collaborative method. While I wish that the exhibits and the public programs received the scholarly scrutiny and weight as some of my academic endeavors, I wanted to make clear in this brief presentation exhibitions are not just the presentation of my research, but rather an established collaborative approach and a research method